A Rose for Emily is William Faulkner's most Gothic of his Southern Gothicism. It's a very frequently anthologized story. It works well in magazines. Amid the entire Faulkner oeuvre, which has intersecting storylines and characters. This one functions very well independently because of its creepiness. Quite honestly, its Gothicism. It is a it is often recognized as a distillation of Faulkner's concern with and vision of the South's reverence for and terrorism by the old order of the Confederacy, and the reverence for that tradition that has in many ways held back the South, the modern Southern United States, the old Confederacy, as it creeps into the 20th century, with many of the same characters still lingering. I think it was Faulkner who said that the past isn't just the past isn't dead, it's not even past. The idea that all of our paths, metaphorically, all of our pasts stay with us, they haunt us, they guide our present, and portend our future. And for Faulkner's characters in living in the aftermath of the Civil War, this is plainly the truth for them, and they have trouble getting out of it. And it seems to be Faulkner's vision, and many critics say this, that the South is in fact trapped and terrorized by the ghosts of its past. Okay. Emily Grierson is a personification of that. She is a local gentry of sorts. Her family has hit some hard financial times, so they're not as prestigious as they once were, perhaps, but she is the little old lady on the block that everybody has known for generations, but who is starting to become a little bit more disturbing. And she is described this way. It's very clear. She is when Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. Nice idea of the esteem that they have, this public-facing respect for the woman, fed by a kind of morbid curiosity, perhaps, that we will learn. The men through a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument, an old statue, statues falling. The idea that she is more than a human being. She is immediately introduced as a symbol, as a trophy of a past glory of sorts. The women mostly out of curiosity to see the inside of her house, which no one save an old manservant, a combined gardener and cook, had seen in at least 10 years. So there you get the two sides of these people, this reverence for the past and the great figures of the past, but also this kind of lurid, morbid curiosity, somewhat envious, somewhat oh, it, that kind of privilege of being aristocracy of a sort creates dissension, creates resentment, and that's what comes out in those little moments in life where you turn the rock over and you see what crawls out. And this, I think, is what's happening here. And you get this story about how she is this little old lady who had a long life, stretching back to presumably the Civil War era, never explicitly mentioned, but she is part of the heritage of that era. Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town. It's not like she was a constructive member of society, and it's just the cross that town has to bear, of sorts. Now, we're told that in that first, that early passage right there that began like that, we're told that she did not have to pay taxes, or at least she didn't pay taxes. And this goes back to a former mayor, Colonel Sartoris, who is it's a familiar name to Faulkner readers from many other works. He had decided, kind of by, it seems like, executive fiat, that the Grierson family would not have to pay taxes to the town. And so that was just sort of the way things were. It was an unwritten rule. And they went through some machinations to make it a rule that would perpetuate. And we're told fairly early on in the story that the next generation, with its more modern ideas, became mayors and aldermen. The arrangement created some little dissatisfaction. These new modern types are saying, well, we can't actually find anything in the books that says you shouldn't have to pay taxes. What is this? And she just flatly insists, no, I do not. She will not even, countenance the question. And here you get this sense of this sort of baked in extra legal exemption or allowance in public life, this privilege that is carved into tradition, if not in law. And this is starting to sound familiar. Now, this story is coming out in, the height of Jim Crow era South. And the examples of, well, we just have our way of doing things here that pervades the South, that resists any sort of modernization or any sort of legal scrutiny, the parallel is fairly obvious. And the haughtiness with which she rejects all of these solicitations from these new modern types in the government, the insistence that no, what she does not pay taxes, it comes in some contradistinction to the fact that her home is largely on the skids. She might not want to pay taxes because she can't pay taxes. There's no evidence that there's any economic activity going on at her house at all. In the later years, she takes to teaching young children how to paint porcelain, very delicate artistic work. I can't imagine that's a particularly remunerative activity, but she does it until they stop coming and she really has evidently no income. Now, maybe I'm assuming there was some family money, but you get the sense that it has been frittered away. Her father left her a little bit in the lurch. And of course, as a proper Southern woman of the mid 1800s, she would have had no real skills. So it is a bit of a sign of, clinging desperately to your privileges as the only dignity left, because the rest of your life is getting awfully shabby around the edges. And Emily Grierson is just indomitably facing that reality down. Now, you can take that and view it as a kind of heroism, because she is demanding her dignity in the face of material decline. She is more and more, you're getting a sense, being ostracized by the town as she gets older throughout the story, even though it's told in like flashback form and the chronology is a little jumbled. But from the beginning, you're told that the women showed up to her funeral kind of anxious just to look inside the house. She's a curiosity. She's an oddity. She is clinging to her traditions. She is clinging to her dignity where she can find it. There is something very recognizably human in that. And you can credit her for that, even if the privileges and the dignity to which she clings is bounded on fundamental inequality, as the suggestion, as the race question bubbles just underneath the surface of this story. Of course, the fallen monument line in the very first sentence brings to mind all of the Confederate war heroes whose statues were going up around the South in this era like crazy as a terrorist movement by local governments and municipalities to remind the new modern folks and the black population of their place. You herald the Confederate heroes of the great lost cause and make clear that in this society, that is your ideal. And that creates a little bit of a organizing principle for the town and lets the people who would be opposing those people, the modern types, the African Americans, the former slaves, and the descendants of slaves, it lets them know where they are in the pecking order. And she is that monument. And it is essentially based on race. There's not a lot of question of race in here, but it is always just beneath the surface. The most explicit case is, of course, her manservant, who is not given a name. He is just, her manservant, her servant, her black servant, identified frequently with the race question there. And he is this shadowy little figure that comes and goes. And there's a troubling characterization there, because, as it turns out, he seems to be complicit in the crime that Emily Grierson has ultimately committed. The comings and goings, the quiet servitude, where he's getting paid, how he's getting paid is completely uncertain. We're told at one point that his life has been so dominated by Miss Emily that he has started to lose his voice. They say that whenever he does speak in town, when he's running around with his little market basket, as he's always shown with, whenever he does speak, his voice sounds kind of harsh and croaky or something, and as if from unuse. You get the sense that his entire life, his entire identity is bound up with this woman, which, if you look at them, allegorically, symbolically, whatever, that's troubling because, well, the only recognizable African-American character in this story is completely subservient to this ideal of Southern heritage. And it's troubling. He has no identity independent of that. And yet, at the very end, we're told that, after she died, he opens the door so that the local town officials or whatever can come in. He lets them in and then just leaves, and we're just given a quick note, and he was never seen again, as if he just, took a powder, said, "All right, I'm out of here." Was he a slave this entire time? Did he have no power to leave up until this point? There are a lot of questions there, and I'm not sure I'm not sure how to take him. I'm not sure how to interpret that character because he is such a blank slate. There are so few details, and they all seem rather pointed. And you could say that Faulkner, and I don't want to get into his character, but you could say that the author, the story, if you will, is trying to paint him as complicit in this, as serving this same evil system. Or you can say that, he did what he had to do and got out the minute he had any sort of freedom. You can go a couple of different ways with this. I'm not sure how to take it. A lot of critics have a lot of different ideas, but it's difficult. Now, of course, the main character in all this is Miss Emily Grierson, and the whole "I do not pay taxes" thing is a great way to characterize her, along with all of the the monument and then care and all of this stuff. The voice or the perspective on her is really quite fixed. It's the narrator itself characterizes itself as we. It is the townspeople writing this, as if the town were a entire corporate body that is now giving voice to this, which is a nice little touch that I find. Okay, the town is so unified, it can speak with one voice about this peculiar character within its midst. But Miss Emily Grierson, of course, is a descendant of this local gentry family. They've fallen on some hard times. They're not necessarily particularly wealthy anymore, but they have this grand old house that everybody recognizes and pays some fealty to. And she is portrayed as being somewhat dominated by her father, this enormous character in her life, in the early years of her life. And as she ages, she becomes increasingly whispered about as an old maid. Well, when is she going to get married? That is her job. Her job is to get married, have kids, and perpetuate the Grierson family line, perhaps under a different name, but that's her job. And she doesn't. For whatever reason, we're not given any, for whatever reason, she never lands above. And the descriptions of her early on is that, well, she seems like a reasonably attractive young woman. She has some money or some prominence. She would be an inviting prospect, but she can't quite land anyone. And this is how this is characterized by the town. And this is a bit of a whisper scandal. Until at one point, a road crew comes to town. They are laying a highway through town. This is a sign of modernization. When you have a paving crew coming in and laying a highway, this is a sign that, okay, you are connecting to the outside world. It is a sign perhaps of it's a sign perhaps that times are changing, that the world is becoming more connected, that new eyes are coming into town to look at their peculiar traditions, and the quirks of their heritage are going to stand out all the more. But in this, there is a young man who starts paying court, it would seem, to Emily. Homer. And he is, he's the foreman. He goes up and down the line and orders his workers around. His workers are just somewhat disparagingly characterized as, like, the lower people. I specifically, some of them are identified as Negroes. So if he's, this is not a respectable group. And he himself is, of all things, horror of horrors, a Northerner. This is troubling. But he's coming by and he's taking around for rides in his little buggy or whatever on Sunday afternoons. And this is her great courtship. Now, there are some problems throughout. The relationship doesn't seem to progress terribly much. People start wondering, well, gee, is he, first, would she ever accept him? Oh my God, he's a Northerner. And he's on a road crew. That's all right. Maybe he's the foreman of it or something, but still, that's hardly a genteel Southern gentleman. But still, people are going to look past that. And yet, time's passing, and he doesn't seem to be coughing up a ring just yet. There is some suggestion as to why that might be. In one curious little passage where it is identified that, he declares himself to be, and then there is a little interposed by Dash's clause where you say, well, he likes hanging out with the guys. And then on the other end of that dash is he is not a marrying kind. This all seems a little coded. This all seems a little, why am I being told that? Why is it being phrased in that way? Why, at another part, was I told that, well, he was wearing yellow gloves when he went out riding with Miss Emily? And there is that subtle hint that perhaps he is homosexual. Perhaps he's gay. And maybe he's just hanging out with Miss Emily in a very platonic way. Or maybe he's using her, as the phrase would have it, as a beard. It's uncertain. But that element is there, and critics will write about it and all of that. But it's a curious little wrinkle. Now, of course, it gets leaked out or something that, well, yeah, okay, it looks like they're going to get married in some form or another. It seems to be agreed upon. She has gone and bought him a number of wedding gifts of sorts. You know, a very nice nightshirt, some little articles of jewelry, and like little, I don't know, little silver things with his monogram on them and all that. But she also takes that troubling trip that we're told about fairly early in the story. She takes a trip to the drugstore and buys arsenic. And she's very curious that it'd be very strong and effective. And the guy behind the counter, who's clearly a little intimidated to be talking to a local aristocrat and doesn't want to question her too hard, still, as a matter of law, I need to know that you're going to be using this on rats. I need you to say that, or something like that. And, well, it takes a little bit of prodding to get her to do this. But she does. But when she says for rats, you get the sense that, well, maybe that's a metaphor. Maybe that's a euphemism. Maybe the rat is our friend Homer. It's troubling. Time passes more, and Homer is not seen so much anymore, and people are wondering, like, what happened? Where'd he go? They saw him walk into the house one day, and then it just doesn't really. He never shows up again. The ending, of course, is the most famous part, where he is. Well, the town starts to complain about there being a smell, and they go. Prominent townspeople go and try and get the local government, the town leaders, to go and talk to Miss Emily about that. And I love their reaction, like, you expect us to go talk to a fine lady like Miss Emily and tell her she smells? I love that. But the real challenge comes when decades later, it would seem, when she is a very old woman and somewhat decrepit. She has become obese. They talk about her as being quite bloated and just like a body that had been sunk in water for a couple of days. There's a sense of this real decaying mass that she is trudging through the town. Nobody's really seen her that much in these last decades. She's been more or less that hermit inside that big imposing house, and this all leads to the mystery and the spookiness of it, the Gothicism. But when she dies, the townspeople are invited in by the manservant who just takes powder out the back door. And then they go and they find Homer's well-decayed corpse lying upstairs on the floor that has been locked for decades now. And the really creepy part, as if that's not creepy enough, is that it looks like, because of the positioning of his arms, or what's left of his arms, and because of a single long gray hair that we're told matches Miss Emily's on the pillow beside him, it would seem that he or that she was laying with his body at night. A kind of necrophilia. That's horrifying. And you know, Faulkner holds that last little image for the very end because he knows how to structure a story to give a punch at the end, and that's that's classic magazine writing, quite frankly. But it invites all of this speculation about the symbolism of it, about how the grand eminence, the grand symbols of the Old South were locked in a perpetual embrace with death and decay, and it's just Faulkner has a curiously objective subjectivity when it comes to the Old South. And he wrote about it in his little Yoknapatawpha County endlessly. And you get a sense of a real identity with this culture, a real fondness at times for this culture, for the politeness of it, for the gentility, for the sweetness of it in many respects, of neighbors knowing one another, and small town life in a aggressively modernizing world. But he knows how to criticize. He knows how to make it. He knows how to point out the South's great flaws. The flaws in human beings in general. And in a little story like this, because it's so clever, it's a genre story straight out. It could find its way into any number of little magazines and anthologies of, spooky tales. But there is that other element, that troubling, critical element that is surprisingly sophisticated and that finds expression in his novels and some of his other stories, where you're shown a subtler artistic vision. It doesn't all have to be the single gray hair on the pillow, but this story, for all of its genre conventions and somewhat, cheesy mechanics, it gets at something very real that Faulkner had that very particular grasp of.